Thank you for coming today. I'm glad you decided to spend your Friday morning with us. I think we have a really good program for you today. My name is Elston Johnson, and I'm going to do just a quick administrative introduction. We're here today talking about cybersecurity. This class is you have opportunity to get CEUs. We want to make sure that when you sign in, you use your operator number. To get your CEUs, please stay to the end so you can complete the evaluation. Also wanted to let you know that we are doing a series of workshops, and part of it is part of the series of generator maintenance and safety. And so we have another workshop coming up in San Angelo, May 23rd, and then one in Corpus on June 18th. And you can find that on, I believe, on the TCEQ website. And again, the focus will be generator maintenance and safety. I would do at this time also want to recognize Mr. Mason Miller from TCEQ. They are sponsoring this workshop for us today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our facilitators.
Thank you, Elston. So thanks, everybody. I'd like to start off again. Thank you, Brazos River Authority, for hosting us, and TCEQ, thank you for the sponsorship of this event. As you guys know, cybersecurity is an ever-evolving topic. So what you guys have currently within your packets, you'll see that we had to have those in about 6 weeks ago, and things have happened since then. So if you see up on the slides a banner at the top that says new slide or added content, that means that we've added those in post-printing, but you will still have the ability to download them from the TCEQ website, or if you're going to be watching the video of this presentation later, you'll have the opportunity to grab them off of there as well. So from a facilitation perspective, as we go through, if there's something that you have a question on, we're going to have question and answer period and open discussion. We're planning for 10 to 15 minutes at the end. But as we go through, if you have a question, we don't want you to lose that thought. So please just go ahead, just raise your hand, ask the question. We'll do our best to answer it. Of course, we are not all-knowing, so there will probably be some questions that you have that we won't answer. But we will get you that answer back, and we can facilitate those back through TCEQ to have them posted on a Q&A slide there too. I like to start off kind of with getting a bit of demographics on the audience that we're presenting to. So how many people here are in operations? Okay, good number. How many people in IT or cybersecurity? And Antoine, I know you're in all of the above, right? So management, a good number. And what about others? Legal, anybody from legal? Anybody from administrative services, risk management, those kind of things? We sometimes get those because cybersecurity affects us all, right? And everybody is concerned about the cybersecurity of your water utility, right? So you're concerned about it. The state is concerned about it, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this presentation here. The federal government, as you can see from the slide up here, that's Chris Wray, he's the director of the FBI. He's concerned about the cybersecurity of your utility. And he's concerned about it from a national security perspective, right? So as we know, water is a lifeline sector. So it is one of the most important sectors that DHS monitors. And that's because without clean water, we don't have a good way to provide the other critical services that we have. So if somebody were able to disrupt our water supply, put something into the water, think of the effect that would have on the healthcare industry, on the transportation industry, on the communications industry. So we're considered a lifeline sector by the Department of Homeland Security, and we get some special attention because of that. So the quote up here from Director Wray concerns the Chinese threat, and Lance is going to talk about that more as we go through, but I'll let him get to that. So we'll start off with some introductions. I'm Doug Short, got my start in cybersecurity about 28 years ago, cybersecurity and IT, in the U.S. Air Force. During that time, I was blessed to have a lot of different jobs. They like to move you around all over the place in the Air Force. So I was an inspection team lead for the National Security Agency and Air Intelligence Agency. I was the commander of the Cyber Operations Schoolhouse, where I was blessed to meet Lance. And Lance is the real talent in this presentation here. He was one of our instructors at the Air Force Cyber Operations Schoolhouse when we stood up cyber operations there. So he'll have a lot of expertise to give you. And then I worked on the joint staff at the Pentagon, working on cybersecurity policy and protection of critical infrastructure from that level. So I retired about 10 years ago and was lucky enough to be hired by Trinity River Authority as their first CIO. So I'm responsible for all IT and cybersecurity for Trinity River Authority. For those of you that aren't familiar with the River Authority, we manage 9 water and wastewater treatment plants, regional plants, the dam on Lake Livingston, so the water supply there. We've got an 18,000 square mile basin, and we've got about 2 million customers, direct customers for our services. So people that really rely on us for that. And I'm blessed that I've got a great team at TRA, and I've got great senior sponsorship at TRA, so they've really allowed us to do a lot in the cybersecurity arena. About 4 or 5 years ago, I started a small side consulting company, Defensor Solutions, and that's the role that I'm here representing today. So at that, I really got a chance to specialize in going out and assisting other utilities. So TRA and DoD are very large things. We have a lot of resources, but with Defensor Solutions, I'm able to go out and assist smaller utilities, MUDs, SUDs, those kind of folks who might not have had an opportunity to get exposure to cybersecurity principles, and so I help them with that. I also sit on the Texas Cybersecurity Council and a bunch of different committees up there that I've worked on since my time here at TRA. And I'll turn it over to Lance and let him take it over from here.
Thank you for that gracious introduction. I think he kind of builds me up a little bit more than I build up myself. So very gracious of him. But my name is Lance Taylor. I have been in the Air Force pretty much my whole adult life, 22 years. The first half of my career, I was in intelligence. I worked as a Korean translator. When I first came in, I was supposed to be an air traffic controller, but the school didn't open up until the following year. So I was going to have to wait a year to get out of Austin. 19 years old, wanted to see the world. I said, I don't want to wait that long. So I went back to the recruiter. I said, I really want to get a different job if I can get out of here sooner. He said, what do you want to do? I said, I don't know, but you know, I love languages and I want to learn about those aliens. So maybe intelligence. And he said, I got the perfect job for you. Turns out that job was to be a translator. Korean was my 4th choice out of 7 available languages at that time. And it turned out to be a really fun language for me to learn, radically different than English. But grammatically identical to Japanese. So if you're ever curious about learning Japanese, you can pick up Korean 3 months after that, or in 3 months after you learn Japanese. So just a little side note. During my time in the military or in the Air Force as a translator, I worked as part of the U-2 reconnaissance mission. This is not a picture of me or any of my colleagues at the time, but this is exactly what we worked on from the 1990s until computers started to evolve a little bit more, and we had less hardwired systems like this and more, digital. But I did that for about 2 years, 2 separate tours in Korea. Then I went on to work at the National Security Agency on the intelligence side, doing more translation work for them. Also worked in the Information Warfare Center in the Air Intelligence Agency, as Doug also had in his career. And then once I got about halfway through my career, I got my degree and became an officer, and I went into cyber at that time. So I did that for the remaining half of my career, and I retired in 2011. Clear was my first job out of the military, and I was lucky enough to get into a position that, no pun intended, was tailor-made for me. It basically takes intelligence tradecraft and applies that to cyber, and that's called threat intelligence. So I started out at Clear as a threat intelligence analyst, and I worked my way over the last 5 years into more of a leadership role. So now I manage Clear Cyber Defense, which includes threat intelligence, among a few other disciplines, 4 different teams. Basically, in a nutshell, our job is to say, what are the bad guys doing? What are they after? How are they doing it? And how do we translate that into defenses for Clear? So why do we conduct this kind of training, and how does it affect everyone? As Doug mentioned, water is basically the lifeline of our communities. And it's a critical part of our daily lives, and without it, the local populations would suffer greatly. In order to meet the demands of our municipalities, we have to ensure continuous operations. Disruptions could severely impact our ability to support our communities. And in some cases, that would result in medical issues for some of our more vulnerable members of the community. And lastly, cybercrime is a lucrative business. This is something that is a 24/7 thing. It is automated, largely automated, as far as how they find victims. And in 2023 alone, ransomware cost businesses more than $1 billion. That's just in the last year. And 40% of those attacks were against critical infrastructure. So that's according to the FBI statistics, and also just to give a little bit of context about why this is such an important thing. Also, I have to apologize up front. I'm still dealing with some allergies that Tex has blessed me with, so I'm going to have an occasional cough here and there. I'm going to try and minimize that with my cough drops. I have a whole handful in my pocket, so I apologize up front if I have the occasional cough. But starting out, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between IT and OT. So information technology, everything on the left there, basically how do we support what we do on a day-to-day basis. Operational technology is everything that's going to be on the right side there. That is typically where the crown jewels lie. Crown jewels being our ability to filter and productize clean water. We differentiate between these two subsystems of technology because they are often necessarily connected to each other. They have to be. You have to be able to send emails to your colleagues. You have to be able to present metrics and information to your various teams, to your leadership. But at the same time, you also need to get paid. I don't think anybody here, as much as you love working in the water industry, would be willing to work for free. So these are interconnected, and they are both very costly when they get disrupted. We think of IT as those systems that enable you to manage your information, like payroll, your company laptops, if you have those issued to you, or any desktop workstations, routers, and HR systems, those things that manage your time off and basically your medical care and that sort of thing. Operational technology comprises the equipment and the systems that facilitate your day-to-day work, the treatment, and the movement of water. Remote terminals, PLCs, and operational status reporting systems, for example. These two subsystems work together and allow you to focus on the business of supporting our communities. In order to work properly and facilitate smooth operations, these systems must not only talk amongst themselves, but also to other systems. And they, as I mentioned before, are interconnected. Your provisioning, for example, for if you are a supervisor and you need remote access to your terminal, your HMIs from home so that you don't have to come in at 3 o'clock in the morning, that has to be provisioned by IT. So that's an example of how you might have interconnectedness with your systems. Some of the security challenges that we face are that this business is a 24-hour system and problems could arise at any time. Remote access is a convenience which allows an operator to fix issues from the comfort of home, and they do present an opportunity for an attacker to abuse that access. There are many users who require access to the consoles, and any one of them could have their accounts compromised if not properly secured. Some of the common threats that we see are that for at least financially motivated cybercrime, they probably a faster rate than we do in the cybersecurity industry. They adopt new technologies very, very quickly, and they are able to automate a lot of this stuff. And automation causes a bigger problem for us because it basically lowers the standard that another threat actor needs to meet in order to get into the game. So you'll see botnets that are basically just compromised systems around the world that they have leveraged into an attack mechanism. And that botnet will scan all of your networks every day, 24/7, and wait for the discovery of an account that has default credentials still in place, or an account that's not even secured at all. And once that's found, automation will then convert that into access for the threat actor. It lets them know, hey, I found an account. It lets them know the default credentials are in place or it wasn't secured at all. Here is the login, here's the link. And the threat actor who owns that botnet simply has to look at what they've harvested from the previous night. Applying best practices is our best defense against these persistent threats, and removing opportunities for attackers by patching our critical systems. Removing those attack vectors by patching these systems is particularly effective, and especially those that are reachable from the public internet. So those remote connections, I would assume, are pretty well secured by each of these industries, each of these critical infrastructure industries. However, there are some that we find occasionally that are not properly secured and are basically just sitting ducks for the botnets.
So I'd like to add something on
Sure, go ahead.
IT versus OT. So from the TRE perspective, whenever I go out and talk to groups, I say, okay, so I'm responsible for both the IT security and the OT security at the authority. And I try to get people to understand that difference. So like, if I lose my financial systems or my HR systems, it's a bad day, right? I can't pay my people, you can't go on PTO, we can't pay our vendors, et cetera. But if I lose my OT systems, we've got a public health and safety issue, right? We have a national security reportable security issue that we have to go through. We have a legal and liability issue. That is a horrible day if I lose those. So we prioritize our OT systems way above what we have in our IT systems, which when Lance mentioned crown jewels is kind of how we look at that. Also, we all have a different architecture that we live within, right? So how many people here have no external connectivity to their operational technology systems? Some do, right? Some have a hybrid where I can pass data from my OT systems up through a demilitarized zone or through a data diode or some other way to do that to my IT systems, which is a more secure method. Some of the things that Lance is going to talk about in a few minutes on the attacks, we'll talk about those remote systems that perhaps didn't have the best practices in place. So even though a lot of times what we see when we go out and we do assessments, people will say things like, no worries, my OT systems aren't connected to the internet in any way. And then 5 minutes later, when we ask them about, hey, what's going on at your remote location over there? They can pull out their phone and they'll say, I can see what's going on out there. Well, that is now connected to the internet. I mean, people see those different data connections differently, right? And how they secure them differently. The key is, the security principles for IT are very strict, for vulnerability management. We accept a lot of patches with no thought, but for OT, we use a much more structured approach for vulnerability management and how we're going to connect those things together. So, any other questions on IT or OT that we can answer for y'all?
All right. Thank you for that. So one thing that I want to also preface the rest of this presentation on is, I know we have a diverse group here. Not everybody here is in IT or familiar with cybersecurity, maybe loosely familiar based on what you read in the news, but I'm going to try and keep it to a minimum as far as, acronyms and things like that are unique to my industry, so that everybody has a clear understanding of the concept itself. Let's go to the next slide here. We're going to talk a little bit about 4 specific incidents. The Colonial Pipeline one, you'll notice that's not related to water, but I did include that in this presentation because I wanted to illustrate the domino effect of a ransomware incident. And Colonial Pipeline, I think, shows that really well. And it is something that I think each of our critical infrastructure entities are potentially susceptible to. So, Doug, did you want to talk a little bit about Dragos? The trends from Dragos?
So I'll need my notes for that one.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So the Dragos is a security platform, a vendor that is out there, and they put out every year, they put out a year in review. So the reference for these numbers was the 2023 year in review report that Dragos put out. So some of the trends that they're noticing, ransomware is increasing. That's not a surprise for anybody here. If you watch the news, you see more and more ransomware attacks going on. The thing is, they're now affecting critical infrastructure a little bit more than they had in the past, actually significantly more than they had in the past. The majority of these start within the IT network, and then they use techniques to laterally transition across to the OT network. So that's why the discussion on IT and OT is so important and how we need to protect both of those. Also, they saw a trend related to ongoing conflicts, right? So if you watch the news, you know we have Israel and Hamas ongoing. We have Russia and Ukraine ongoing. You have a lot of turmoil in China and Taiwan, right? So each one of these nation states has their own cyber professionals, just like the United States does, that conduct cyber operations, right? So the thing about malware, et cetera, unless it is very specifically tailored, is there's a chance for that malware to spill over to unintended targets, right? Because of the interconnectedness of the internet. That's why, I mean, if you think back to the 90s, there's some people here that would remember the 90s. So you would think of like the Melissa virus and how quickly that spread, the Love Me virus and how quickly that spread across. That's due to the internet connectivity, right? So these things that are designed as a cyber weapon can then spill over out of that. Lance will talk about hacktivism. And then one of the real key concerns that I think that they brought out in their report is, okay, so at some point these conflicts are going to end, right? What is going to happen to all of those capabilities that these people now have? They've been told that they can go out and they can hack. Some of them have been able to do things that are considered illegal and sponsored by their government. The presumption is they're going to still want to do these things, right? They may go to work for an intelligence agency, or they may just decide they want to be an independent contractor, sometimes known as a hacker, and go out and spread that. And then they've got all of this years of training, years of experience. So we're going to be facing a much more difficult threat in the future as that evolves, right? The more training you give somebody, obviously the better they become at their craft. The more practice you give them, the better they become at their craft. And then they'll go out and sell that to the highest bidder, which could be the Russian mafia, the KGB, any of those folks. So we do face a significant raised threat from that, according to the Dragos report. So back to you, Lane.
All right. So Doug mentioned hacktivism. One of the things that I wanted to point out related to hacktivism, and for those who aren't familiar with what hacktivism is, basically it's people who are ideologically driven to embarrass or disrupt their ideological opponent through cyber means. So basically website defacement or trying to exfiltrate all of the users for that particular movement, for a website that belongs to, let's say, somebody that you are politically against. If you can download all of those credentials and then provide those either for sale on the dark web or make them public and say, look at all these people who are members of this group or supporters of this group, right? So that is hacktivism. It's not financially motivated. It's also technically not nation state oriented. So The reason I want to call out hacktivism is that some of the intelligence reporting indicates that there is increasingly more of an overlap between what we're seeing that seems like hacktivism and what the nation state hackers are trying to do, Russia, China, Iran. They are, under the guise of hacktivism, practicing or doing dry runs their attacks against critical infrastructure. So I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss something as hacktivism and therefore benign. It does have the potential to be something greater that just hasn't revealed itself yet. And the intent here is not to spread what we call fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It is really just to make everyone aware, because if anyone's read what happened against MGM recently, they were attacked, and that attack started with the threat actor just calling the help desk and having a person's user account reset so that they could get access to that account. They used what we call social engineering techniques. It's basically just tricking someone. And they tricked the help desk into giving them access to an account. Once they got into that account, they were able to leverage that into a full-on ransomware attack. And that attack cost, I don't even have the figures, but I want to say in the hundreds of millions or dozens of millions at least of not only reputational damage, but also financial damage. A lot of residents in the hotel at that time could no longer get into their rooms. Gaming systems weren't paying out, and so on. So all of that began with just a simple attack on one seemingly unrelated account. And it was an account that didn't even have any real power, but they were able to leverage that into something greater. Recent intelligence indicates, as I mentioned before, that Russia is using regional attacks on critical infrastructure, like for example in Estonia, Georgia, Ukraine, as a test run for how they intend to attack US critical infrastructure. These seemingly small attacks do have strategic value. All right, so let's discuss a few recent incidents involving critical infrastructure. This one I'm particularly fascinated by. As a threat intel guy by nature, I may be scared of what capabilities our enemies might possess, but at the same time, I am equally fascinated with the tradecraft. So when Stuxnet happened, thankfully it turned out to be ours rather than Russia's or China's. But when that happened, I was fascinated by the tradecraft that was employed in creating this malware. This is goes down as one of the most prolific and advanced cyber weapons ever created. Stuxnet was an advanced malware that targeted a very specific uranium processing plant in Natanz, or the Natanz facility in Iran. The intent of this malware was to delay Iran's nuclear ambitions by at least several years. And this was later reported to be a joint U.S.-Israeli operation. Stuxnet looked for a very specific equipment made by Siemens, and namely that which controlled the centrifuge reporting systems. Has anyone here watched, I think it was either Mission Impossible or a James Bond movie, where the hackers hack into the video system and they run some fake video of nothing happening? Meanwhile, on the back end, somebody's actually breaking in and doing stuff. Has anybody seen those? Hands up. Okay. All right. So Stuxnet did sort of a version of that, but the digital version. Stuxnet made the readouts on the machines look like everything was normal with the centrifuges. Meanwhile, the centrifuges were spinning outside of the tolerance levels, and that's what ended up breaking all of these centrifuges and destroying all of the uranium that was inside. So really, really impressive. If the malware found that Siemens equipment, it attacked it. If it didn't find it, it just simply deleted itself. and it moved on to try and find other locations where this equipment might be. Let's see, and then so the centrifuges were destroyed as planned, and the operators were not aware until it was too late. Those pieces of equipment were fully destroyed beyond repair. We'll talk about the Municipal Water Authority in Aliquippa, or is that Aliquippa? I don't know, I'm not a water guy. Aliquippa? Aliquippa, okay, all right. So sometimes attacks are based on political ideology. That's hacktivism, as we were talking about previously. And in this case, an Iranian hacktivist group, because of the conflict between Israel and Hamas, decided to target Unitronics PLCs, and because that was an Israeli-based company. And so these PLCs were known for poor default security when they were shipped out to various locations, and they relied on the buyer of this equipment to change those credentials, those login credentials, to make it more secure. And as you know, sometimes people will people, and sometimes that step got skipped. So you had these PLCs that were just available for the attack. At this particular facility, systems administrators, they connected this particular PLC to the internet without changing the default settings. And therefore, it was easy to compromise, and the attackers briefly took control to take a booster station offline. Now, Colonial Pipeline is not a water treatment facility. It's not really related to that, but it is critical infrastructure. And I point this out because it was a particularly devastating attack. It's one of the major transport lines for petroleum from Texas to New York, basically the full East Coast. 45% of the East Coast's fuel arrives through this pipeline. And it's not that the attacker necessarily compromised operational technology, but rather this attack focused on the billing system that Colonial used. And so it's not that they couldn't deliver the oil, or the petroleum, it was that once they delivered it, they had no way to bill the customer and track who paid and who hasn't. So in order to protect themselves from financial loss, just decided to shut off delivery. So this was a ransomware attack, and it was financially motivated. How much can we get them to pay in order for us to restore their system? That's basically how the threat actors think. This halted deliveries until the billing system could be restored. The attackers were called darkside ransomware, and Colonial decided to pay them $4.4 million within hours of the attack. It should be noted, a lot of these decisions to pay out are based on cyber insurance. So if Colonial had a cyber insurance policy, which I'm sure they did, it's based on how much is the insurance willing to pay out. And what threat actors are doing, because they are not uneducated people, they will go and get into your network, and then they will start looking for your cyber insurance policy to see how much your insurer will pay out. And then that's how much they will ask for. So it's not always related to how much revenue do you generate. Okay, moving on to any questions about Colonial?
So I'd just add, I mean, if anyone is in the decision-making process or in the advisory process to whether or not to pay a ransom, hopefully nobody ever gets ransomware, I'll just say the FBI advises, don't pay the ransom. Now, in some cases, you will hear stories of the FBI coming in and requesting to capture all of the equipment and taking the equipment away. Now, what the FBI has told me directly is now they are not quite as heavy-handed as they previously were. So they understand that you still have a business to run. We still have to clean water, and if you take all my servers away, I'm not going to be able to perform that mission. So it is ultimately a business decision. They advise you not to pay the ransom because, number one, you're dealing with criminals. They're kind of sketchy to start off with, right? So they may or may not be able to actually deliver the decryption keys that they promise, or the decryption may not work appropriately, and then you will be back in the same thing. And what's to keep those criminal elements from then saying, Lance is a payer? here's how we got into his system, let's do it again, right? Or giving that to somebody else so that they can then get into your system. So advice is, don't pay the ransom. There are apparently cases where paying the ransom may be the lower risk opportunity to move forward with. That is a business decision to push forward with ransomware. So,
is anyone here aware that TextDot was hit with ransomware a few years ago? Probably the cybersecurity guy. And they were down for about, I want to say, a month, as far as not being able to resume operations, because they decided not to pay the ransomware and they were going to restore from backup, but they had to resort to pen and paper in the meantime. So one other thing that is sort of a +1 for not paying the ransom is that the FBI does not publish this necessarily, but they have a lot of decryption keys available, right? So if they, as they did most recently, shut down one of the most prolific ransomware operations called Lockbit, they worked in conjunction with the international law enforcement community to shut down the ransomware operation and to arrest, or at least, sorry, he's not going to be extradited from Russia because they don't extradite their citizens, but he has been sanctioned by the US and by the UK, and they were able to harvest all of those decryption keys from their system. So any victims who may currently be under attack or at least have all their systems locked up, there might be a decryption key available. So it's always great to reach out to the FBI. Even if you intend to pay, just reach out first and say, do you have an existing decryption key for this that we can try? So really good option there. Yes, go ahead, question?
I'm Stan Lewis, manager there at Nash Forest and Water, South Waxahachie. And I got the dates, but about 10 days right before Christmas, you know how it is, we're all trying to wind down, get a little Christmas spirit and everything like that. So it's hard to do, but anyway, I go into the office early and ransomware hit us. And so I get on the internet, you know, what's going on? Well, it looked like Lockheed Martin, Procter & Gamble, tons were hit. Why us? You know, so we're we're done. We got, you know, we're done. And so I called my guy. He's a wonderful guy. He was in Navy intelligence. He's retired, but he freelances. So he came down there and he looked at it. He said, "Oh man, this is real." He said, "You got hit by this ransomware," and he said it's called, you know, we wrote it. Y'all probably know about it. And so he said, "Let me go get you some new hard drives. Let me see if I can get up in the cloud and pull all this down." And thank God we had him, because about 4 days later we had everything running back online. But now they wanted $10,000, but he figured they couldn't get that from our insurance company information on our website on us. So they must have went through EMC and found out somehow what all we could afford. That's the only way they could get that, because that was one of our that was one of our that they'd pay. And so I try to relax, you know. You know how we are. We're getting forms done with 15 different forms for TCQ and EPA and everything. So I'm going like, oh man. But anyway, I said, "Dear Lord, just, you know, we're going to get through this." He's a wonderful guy. And so he got us all, you know, going again. And the first thing he said is, "Y'all not going to pay that $10,000. We're going to get this fixed." But he was worried. Mm-hmm. He was worried. Yeah. So we've got all of our billing and all of our billing are off on a server that cannot get out there until we need to download upgrades from RDS. Mm-hmm. And we're on for just a little bit and off. And he's got a little program to check and to see if anything got in on our billing and our people's information. But we're still, we're still out there. I mean, when I talk to TCQ and Tree River Authority and Tarrant Regional Water District and everybody else, Texas Water Development Board, we're out on there. I mean, we're still wide open, but all of our other stuff, he fixed it where they can't get in, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to tell you that. It was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. You, so for the recording, because the recording may not necessarily have picked up what you were describing there, but in summary, not paying the ransom sometimes does pay off, because if you have knowledgeable people who can get you back up and running from backups and plug the holes that were exploited in the first place, is sometimes an option, and you don't know that unless you explore that. But a quick note about how much to pay. They don't necessarily have to find your cyber insurance policy. They may also just do research on your company, market research, and say, okay, well, you just declared in your latest SEC filing that you made this much, you have this much cash reserves, and so we want that cash reserves. We want you to pay us $300 million. So it is very, very lucrative for them. They have nothing to lose, and it is very difficult for the international, even with international support, sometimes very difficult to get these people extradited to the U.S. To face consequences. Okay, let's move on to Volt Typhoon, and then we'll talk about Sandworm. We'll finish up with Sandworm, which is a new slide. So Volt Typhoon, I'm sure everybody here, is there anybody here not familiar with Volt Typhoon by now? Okay, so Volt Typhoon is really just what my industry loves to do is give all of these really interesting names to attackers. And everybody has their own set of names. Microsoft started out using the elements of the periodic table, so they would call this threat actor beryllium. But they have since moved away from that and started using, I think, weather-related terminology like typhoon. And so it describes, instead of a specific threat actor, it describes a series of attacks and the motivation behind those attacks. And that's kind of how they cluster specific threat actors with the name itself. So Volt Typhoon in this case refers to Chinese nation-state actors, or at least it's believed that they are Chinese, that there's a China nexus to the attackers. They have been extremely persistent in terms of years, not months. Their focus is on critical infrastructure for sabotage objectives, basically pre-positioning for later executing chaos and destruction, or disruption, I should say, but also destruction. What separates nation-state actors from financially motivated attackers is the incredible level of sophistication and patience that they exhibit. They will get into your system and not do anything for 2 months. And then after 2 months, they may do something for about a week, and then they'll wait another 6 months. And then they'll come back and they'll do more stuff. So it's very different than what we see with financially motivated attackers who just want to get in, get paid, and get out. And that's it. They are patient, they're elegant, and they're knowledgeable about security practices, and they're skillful with their execution. For example, you may not notice a leak in your home with 1 drop per week, but you'll notice it after your basement is flooded in 8 months when there's a whole pool of water in your basement. And that's kind of how we see nation-state actors being discovered. This is a new slide. This is Sandworm, a discussion about Sandworm. They have a Russia nexus to them. And this nation-state group is also focused on critical infrastructure. This slide will not be in your handouts, but we will provide these afterwards in digital form. Their strategic objective so far seems to be causing chaos when it is strategically necessary. So for example, we have an election coming up, a very important election. If Russia decides that it is in their best interest to sow chaos at the time of the election or cause doubt into the results of that election, then they may execute attacks on critical infrastructure to sort of distract people or distract our government and their response capability so that they can go in and manipulate results or go in and execute a lot of disinformation campaigns. So, but the strategic objective seems to be focused on causing chaos when it's appropriate. While seemingly harmless, the attack in Muleshoe, Texas recently seemed to hint at a practice run. It was dismissed pretty quickly as the work of hacktivists. There was a group called Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, and they said they did this based on political ideology. But there is a belief that this group overlaps with some of the nation-state work that they do on behalf of the Russian government. As with the Volt Typhoon attackers, they are patient and knowledgeable. Critical infrastructure compromise is often just one prong of a multi-pronged coordinated attack. All right, so let's see. I don't know if it's going to pop up here. I had an embedded video.
Russian spies have targeted the South Plains, attacking digital infrastructure in Muleshoe, Hale Center, and Lockney. The U.S. cybersecurity firm Mandiant says hackers caused a water tank to overflow in Muleshoe for about 45 minutes back in January, leaving city crews to eventually take the machine offline and switch to manual operations. At the same time, Lockney and Hale Center reported suspicious cyber activity on their networks. However, authorities say the string of events did not affect drinking water in the towns. Experts say those who claimed responsibility have been linked to a notorious unit of Russia's military intelligence agency. The FBI is currently working on cases in all 3 towns. If confirmed, this would mark an escalation of Russia targeting U.S. critical infrastructure. As of today, Muleshoe City Manager Ramon Sanchez says the city has replaced the system that was hacked.
Okay, and then another new slide here. Really, this is just to kind of summarize what we're seeing right now against the water industry, but also critical infrastructure as a whole. We usually see that any given organization may be targeted by one nation state actor and multiple financially driven hackers who are interested in, let's say ransomware or initial access and so on. It is definitely unprecedented to have 3 different nation-state attackers focused on your area. So the water industry now has 3, according to intelligence, U.S. intelligence, and the law enforcement community. As at a recent cybersecurity conference, the former NSA boss had this to say about it. You get the added specter of sometimes the nation-state intelligence services are wrapping themselves in the cloak of anonymity of the hacktivists to go out and give it a nudge even further. Joyce told the RSA conference, "It's scary to watch." The Cyber Army of Russia Reborn claimed credit for the Muleshoe attack, but it's believed that this group is simply a plausible deniability cover for Russian intelligence. The 3 nation-state actors that are focused on critical infrastructure and also more specifically water are China. They seem to be pre-positioning for a cyber war that should tensions arise with the U.S. over some of the conflicts that Doug pointed out. Russia also pre-positioning for disruption and chaos in the event of tensions with the U.S. And then finally, Iranian hackers are a spillover from the Hamas Israel conflict, and they seem to be focusing most of their attacks on any equipment or companies that are owned by the Israeli government. And I do also have a couple of links in the digital copy that we will send out to you for a very interesting interview with the Russian hacktivist group that attacked Muleshoe. Any questions on any of the attacks or the nation states before I turn it over to Doug to talk about the regulatory and legislative updates?
So I would just add, so what you see here, I mean, it seems like it's small in scale, right? We're seeing, 3 towns in Texas that were reported as having a potential attack by the Sandworm group. What you really see when, having been on the other side of the intelligence curtain, is those are just the ones that are being reported, right? There's a lot more activity going on. There's a lot more behind the scenes that is not being reported. So if you take that, it may be, and I can't give you a real number, but a factor of 10 times more, that people have seen indications, they might have contacted law enforcement, but these things aren't getting reported out into the public news cycle. So the threat is bigger than just these isolated cases that Lance brought out here. So.
And just to close out too, another reminder, this is not to spread a lot of fear about this. It's really just to make you aware that there is definitely heavy interest by foreign nations in penetrating our critical infrastructure and exploiting that when necessary. So the more people are aware of that, the more they view things like an incoming email with more of a suspicious eye, so it doesn't turn into something worse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So and just kind of a ray of hope and all this specter of bad news. So I was at a conference a couple of months ago, and Rob Lee was one of the keynote speakers. He is the CEO for the cybersecurity firm Dragos. And it generally, the theory was, as cyber defenders, we have to be right 100% of the time, right? And the threat actor only has to be right once, right? And that's a pretty bleak picture. But he said, in reality, he said a small, like a mid-sized utility, not somebody with a ton of money, was actually a victim of a state-sponsored persistent attack, and they had given a call. Dragos was actually on the response team that went out there, and they were able to successfully repel it by just putting some basic cybersecurity practices in place. Because if you have a good cybersecurity baseline, you're going to take care of the vast majority of all potential attacks. So just a little bit of a ray of hope. It's not hopeless. If you invest a little bit in cybersecurity and you have a good baseline of cybersecurity controls in place, you can thwart very sophisticated attacks. Now, on the a little bit darker side, I'm going to talk about legislation that's come down and legislation that is on its way, because whenever these things get out into the public realm, our political side decides, hey, we have to do something about it. We have to do something about it really fast. So I'm going to go through some of this. Some of this is existing. Some of this is proposed in future. But we're going to talk about things at the federal level, the state level, and some of the other folks, and close out with a proposed regulatory guidance that is now sitting as a bill in Congress. So everybody familiar with the American Water Infrastructure Act 2018? It required you guys to do a risk and resilience assessment and an emergency response plan by the EPA if you serve more than 3,300 customers. Not 3,300 connections, 3,300 customers. So if you had more than those, you had to do these things, and that was the timeline that was initially given. If you didn't do those things, then the EPA is probably going to come out really quickly and decide that they want to fine you for non-compliance. You probably already got some very nasty letters from them. Hopefully everybody already did them. The other thing to remember is that's a 5-year recurring requirement, so you need to readdress those plans. And if you haven't, you're probably due in the 2025-2026 timeframe. And you'll need to set some money aside to have those done if you're not doing them internally yourself for budgeting purposes. Okay, so back in 2022, the president came down and said, hey, we need to do something about cybersecurity in the water sector. And he put together a 100-day plan and task force to kind of go and address that. EPA was on it, the Cybersecurity Information Security Agency, CISA, part of the Department of Homeland Security was on it. The Water Sector Coordinating Committee had a role there as well. Council. So they established this, and their main goals were, how do we get better information sharing? How do we get ICS visibility and monitoring going? As all good government things go, the 100-day task force, after about 6 months of meeting and work, was really basically around the folks from the water sector educating the EPA on cybersecurity principles and how the water sector is very diverse. and we need something special to be done. So while this closed with no real action coming out of that, it did help raise the level with the EPA. CERCIA reporting, is anybody familiar with that? That is, and I'll have to read it, Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act. This has passed Congress and was signed into law, and it went out for them to actually go through the rulemaking process. So defining the specifics of that. That is currently out for public comment, and all comments are due back in sometime in July. I can't remember the exact date. So if you guys would like to make comment on this, go out and read the entirety of the bill and the guidance that is out there. The big things that are part of it, and you will need to have addressed in your emergency response plans, are if you suffer a significant cyber incident, you will need to report that within 72 hours. If you pay a ransom, you have to report that within 24 hours. And basically, the proposed things that you have to report are right here on the left, and there's a link to that information there and who you can contact. So these things should be in your cybersecurity emergency response plan. Yes?
Just a quick question. What qualifies as a severe cyber incident?
So this came out about 2 weeks ago, and I have not had a chance to do that. So when they went through the original process of defining that, that was one of the big questions that the water sector sent back to them. Hey, what do you mean by significant cyber incident? Now, not I found malware and it was contained on Doug's computer, or not something that was repelled by my firewall, those kind of things. So I have not had a chance to go out yet and read the specifics of this several hundred pages of guidance, but great question. The devil is always in the details, right? Also in 2022, the governor put out executive action, commonly referred to as the TikTok ban for state agencies. What I will say is you need to check with your legal advisor on applicability to your organization. When I took this to our lawyer, I was surprised that he said, because of our status as a political subdivision, this applies to state agencies, not specifically to us. That said, there is an issue with due diligence. You have to do your due diligence as well. So I would suggest if you haven't looked at all of this guidance coming down, and there's more than just TikTok, you need to take a look at that for your agency or your municipality and at least consider the governor's guidance, because when there, or if there is an incident that is involved, any of these things as they come up, you are going to have to answer questions about why you did not adopt the governor's best practice. And from an insurance perspective, if you did not adopt governance best practice, they may deny your claims.
Question.
Yes.
Is there a real threat for TikTok, or is that just politically motivated?
I believe there is a very real threat from TikTok. Yes. So on the data collection side, all of that data, and I will parrot what you hear in the news at this point, that data is controlled by TikTok. They have location data, all your geolocation data, where you're going, sites you're visiting, things you're watching. That is susceptible to the Chinese government's oversight, right? In Chinese law, they have the authority for any Chinese company, cannot deny them access to information. So all of that information that is out in TikTok could be exploited by the government. Did you have something to add there?
Yes, just wanted to add to that as I talked about before with influence operations, if TikTok controls, it's a very, very popular app. And if it controls with its algorithm what you see, and they are beholden to the Chinese Communist Party, then if the Chinese Communist Party says, we don't want this person or that person to be elected president, they could then change the algorithm to start pushing out videos to all the users that damage those political candidates in some way or shape public opinion enough that people change their votes. Or because TikTok is really, really popular with some of the younger generations who typically don't vote, they could manipulate their understanding of what's going on in the political process, the political arena, all of these really hot button issues. They could shape their understanding just enough to get them to go out and vote the way they want them to vote. So that is one aspect that makes TikTok very dangerous, especially when it comes to the vast amounts of data that Doug mentioned that they can harvest, because they can analyze what the public opinion looks like right now across the demographics. So that's just one thing I wanted to add.
So the governor's action actually contained 5 objectives. TikTok is only one of the companies and organizations that is covered under prohibited technologies here. Right. So this is the list. You can find it on the DIR website of all the prohibited technologies. So the ones that I would say are probably of the most concern. People are still using Kaspersky antivirus software, which is produced by a Russian citizen. TikTok is also highly utilized. And if you look here back on Objective 2, prohibit employees and contractors from conducting state business on any device that has these prohibited technologies on them. So if I have my cell phone, I have TikTok on that app, and I am using that to access critical infrastructure assets, or if I am using that to process email, invoices, et cetera, according to the governor's action, that is not to be conducted. Another area that is very on the hardware side, security cameras. If you look at DJI and Hikvision, the vast majority of all the security cameras on the market are coming from these Chinese producers, and they are on the governor's list of not to use. It gets very tricky because when it says or any subsidiary thereof, you have to be very careful because they're not going to be named in the US DJI or Hikvision. It will be Lance Camera, and it's just rebranded Chinese gear for that. So you have to be very cognizant when you go out to buy these items. The EPA put out a memorandum in 2023. Is everybody aware of that? That's the one that said we're going to conduct cybersecurity as part of the sanitary surveys that are done. And this was a mandate that came from the EPA down to all of the water utilities and to TCEQ for implementation, or I'm sorry, the state for implementation. It would be obviously TCEQ. In this case, that was challenged in court, and that is no longer, that rule was withdrawn. So it is still important though. So we're going to kind of go through it, and then when we talk about the future, you'll see why it's important. So basically, they're asking to do assessments based on the cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals for critical infrastructure that CISA put out, and then they recommended a process of these 5 steps, which is very reasonable, right? Get people together, collect the information, conduct the assessment, analyze the result, mitigate the plans. Very similar to what you guys are doing in your sanitary inspections for other things right now. One of the big issues with it was the sector did not believe that the people that were conducting sanitary surveys would necessarily have the background and experience to conduct a cybersecurity assessment, right? Very different skill sets. Very good at cleaning water and determining how we clean water. Probably not the right people to look at cybersecurity. This is what they want you to look at. These 33 controls, and I will say every one of these controls is a good control. The things that you need to be considered, is do these controls fit your utility and your specific architecture, right? Because each one of these controls has a cost to it, right? So you have a cost to buy equipment to implement. That's a fixed capital cost that's going to come at the beginning. But then the part that is more difficult is you have to have the people to work these controls, right? They have to be able to collect and validate the information. They have to provide assessments on all of these controls and how you move forward. Otherwise, the controls will be out of date within a matter of weeks or months, and they will become less than effective because you think that you're protected because you've implemented these controls, but in reality, the world of cybersecurity has moved on, and you're as vulnerable as you were previously. So, good controls, they just have an ongoing cost that that needs to be considered. Just earlier this year, CISA put out some guidance that if you haven't seen it yet would probably be worth a look. They were very collaborative with the water sector when they put out the Water and Wastewater Cybersecurity Incident Response Guide. It is mainly focused on reporting guidance, who they would like for you to report to, et cetera, and how you would interact with the federal government. So it's good. It is not going to replace your emergency response plans, but it could assist with developing those emergency response plans, updating those emergency response plans going forward. And it definitely is a very good resource to look at. Okay, so this is new content. This just came out last month as part of the AWWA team that did the fly-in to the Capitol to talk to our congressional representatives and senators, which really turned out to be a lot of very young staffers. We went in and proposed a regulatory structure for the future, which had been proposed by several of the water associations previously, right? So what we are looking at is a co-regulatory structure with EPA providing governmental oversight, but the difference being from the previous approach, the sector would provide the expertise within the Risk and Resilience Organization to say, let's not just do these things based upon blanket best practice. Let's actually tailor them to the water sector and the diversity of the water sector to get through there. So this is actually sitting now as HR 7922, introduced by Representative Crawford from Arkansas in Congress. And we'll see what happens with this going forward. But when you look at that and you look back at this will likely be something very similar, tailored to the water sector and tailored to the diversity of the size of the organizations within the water sector and how those architectures are built and maintained will be part of this if it passes, or the implementation thereof. And it's based upon, if you're familiar, if you do hydropower, if you're familiar with NERC-FERC, it's based on that co-regulatory model, but everything that is in NERC-FERC is not going to be appropriate for the water sector because we are not as interconnected as the electric grid, et cetera. So it will be different, but similar. Also, just a few weeks ago, the White House and National Security Council sent a memo to all of the governors, an invitation to come to a classified security briefing. Basically, the output from that was each state was asked to develop a cybersecurity plan specific for the water sector and provide that plan back to the government by the end of June. We're unsure of what's going to come out of that. Obviously, the governor's office will lead that charge and the state agencies will have their say. I am hearing through the grapevine that this will come out as a letter or guidance to us as water agencies to basically better publicize the resources that are available to assist and the things that the state can provide to assist. But that's still to come out. So this is all conjecture on my part. Okay. And we'll move on now. We're going to kind of switch. We've kind of covered some of the background and the history. And now we're going to go into how would you effectively posture yourselves to provide cybersecurity within your organizations. So, excuse me, I might need one of those. The first thing that I think, and one of the most important things, is you need to have a governance structure, right? So you guys have that for other programs. It's not radically different. You have it for your safety program, you have it for your capital improvement programs, those kind of things. You need a similar structure that outlines how you are going to conduct cybersecurity for your organization. So when we talk about governance, basically it's how are you going to manage the processes, the policies, the procedures? How are you going to implement them, make sure that they are advertised and communicated across your organization, and that your people are accountable and these things are enforced, right? So key components of cybersecurity guidance. So you have to have policies and procedures. Most of you probably have a really good start on that. What is acceptable use? How is OT different than IT? How would your incident response plans on the IT side be different from your incident response plans on the OT side? How are you going to conduct your backups? Who would compose your governance team? The roles and responsibilities are very important. You really need to have somebody at a very senior level in your organization be your sponsor for cybersecurity, because traditionally cybersecurity gets a lot of pushback, right? It's kind of like insurance. You buy insurance in the hope you never have to use it. You pay for cybersecurity in the hope that you'll never see an attack, right? So it's very similar to that insurance model. There is an initial investment that needs to be made, so you need to have somebody or some group high in the organization to do that. Then they have to have the ability to apply resources and to establish accountability to make sure things are done. Generally, it's organization-wide, because when you look at cybersecurity controls, if I go back to those 33 controls, every one of them is going to have an impact to the business operation of your organization, right? We don't want to implement a control in a way that is going to hinder operations. So, I mean, I can give you the most cyber secure plant in the world by just locking the gates and shutting everything down. It is secure, but you can't do your job. So the focus for this organization needs to be, what is sensible cybersecurity, right? How much cybersecurity can we put in place to give us the best protection while weighing the risks and our ability to still conduct effective operations? So to do that, you need a cross-functional team to at least weigh in on all these controls, right? My idea of what would be good cybersecurity may differ from Antoine's. And if I give a blanket, let's apply this control, Antoine's opinion may be, if I apply that control, it's going to cost me thousands of dollars in additional labor cost or vendor cost or contract cost to implement that control, and it's going to slow down my operation, right? So those things need to be considered. You'll need to adopt a framework or standards. You don't want to start from scratch, and it can be any number of frameworks. NIST has a great framework. ISO has a framework. IEEE has a framework. They're all good. You just want something to guide your efforts so that you don't have to start from scratch. Make sure communications is across the entirety of the organization. We already talked about establishing accountability. And then cybersecurity is a journey. It's never going to be over. You're always going to have to go back and readdress, right? You're always going to be changing things. So you need to have a continuous improvement plan in place, and that's normally your governance group that would be responsible for that. Similar to other things, if you have a 5-year strategic plan for business operations, if you have a 5 or a 10-year capital improvement plan, you should probably also have an improvement plan for your cybersecurity operations as you're going forward. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Lance now.
I want to make sure I keep us on time here. I know we have you until noon, but you know, we may get off track a little bit because I am talkative, verbose, and loquacious. So, all right, now let's go over some of the things that we can do to better secure our operational technology. We usually look at securing any technology, really, whether it's IT or OT, with a multi-pronged approach. And that approach involves training and awareness, teaching our users, as we are today, about some of the threats that we face, the ways that they are executing those threats, and how best to defend against those. We also take an inventory of our assets. You can't really patch things that you don't know you have. If you're spinning up new assets and those aren't being reported in or tracked closely, then now, and especially if you have that connected to the public internet in some way, that's something that's going to be vulnerable eventually. We'll talk about network segmentation, limiting where an attacker can go after compromising the network. I'm going to pop another cough drop here. Securing remote access, as we discussed a little bit earlier, the convenience of being able to access some of these HMIs from home, that also could be a threat, initial threat vector or initial attack vector. So maybe securing that would be very important. And then incident response planning and vulnerability management. What do we do in a crisis? And at what point are we going to make a crucial decision to shut down a specific system? And the vulnerability management piece to that is executing what we call attack surface reduction. Your attack surface is basically everything that you have that a threat actor can see, whether that is from the internet or after they've already accessed your network. So that is your attack surface, and it all can be attacked if you don't patch it, if you're not aware of the asset in the first place, or finally you haven't secured it by changing default credentials, as we pointed out in the Unitronics PLC attack. So let's go into that. Okay, with the training and awareness piece, as with any system, training and educating our users is key to helping people make smart decisions. And educating those users on some of the threats that we're facing is really crucial to helping people understand why it's important. As we talked about with the MGM attack, that all started with just a social engineering attack against the help desk or the service desk. One seemingly unrelated or unimportant account could turn into something greater or a greater, have broader implications to you in the long run. Sadly, human trust is the weakest link in even the strongest of defense strategies. By nature, we tend to trust people by default. Maybe some of you don't, but we tend to want to trust people, and we tend to want to believe that they are good-natured or good intended. Knowing who the attackers are, what they're after, and how they get in is helpful in planning our defense, which is where threat intelligence comes in, what I started doing when I first started at Clear. And threat intelligence helps you understand what is happening on the underbelly of the internet that most people don't get to see. Some people call it the dark web, other people call it the closed internet because you need a special type of browser to be able to access it. And so we get to see what's happening on the underbelly of the internet. You would be surprised at the full-on ecosystem that is created on the underbelly of the internet or the dark web. I mentioned initial access brokers or initial access before. There are people who specialize in penetrating your network and then selling that to other threat actors who want to execute ransomware. We have now what we call ransomware as a service, where ransomware actors have full-on infrastructure that they will rent to you for a slice of the pie. So as users become more educated, they'll make smarter decisions, and that makes for a better defense. Talking about asset inventory and knowing what you have, it's very difficult to secure what you don't know is out there. Sometimes we call that shadow IT. OT systems evolve as the requirements might fluctuate for your organization. And maintaining an accurate inventory of your assets helps us identify vulnerabilities and also to prioritize patching for those systems. As we add more systems, our infrastructure footprint becomes larger and sometimes unmanageable. You might have a reduced staff who is responsible for 10,000 different types of equipment. And so that becomes very difficult to manage sometimes for those people, and patching ends up suffering because it takes longer and longer for them to be able to patch all the vulnerable systems. Users can sometimes skip crucial steps for the sake of convenience. If you have 10 PLCs to bring online, do you feel like changing all of their default passwords if you haven't yet institutionalized an automated way to do this? Probably not. Knowing where these assets might be deployed is also critical in prioritizing. what gets patched first and what might be more vulnerable. Network segmentation, is there anyone here who's not familiar with that? What that means, what that refers to? Okay, all right, great. So this is a best practice that is executed not just within critical infrastructure, but also in private sector entities. And it is implemented because it is very effective. You reduce what we call the blast radius of an attack by segmenting everything or grouping everything by its function and limiting the access between clusters so that if one cluster is successfully attacked, they can't leverage that into lateral movement into another segment. It makes it much easier to cordon off compromises and narrow down where the attack happened if you should be the unfortunate victim in an attack. And the diagram here depicts one example of what network segmentation might look like. I don't know how much detail you can see in some of the smaller print there, but the idea basically is just things are grouped by function. Noting how the IT systems where many attacks start are limited to just one level of the segment, one segment. And this makes investigations, post-incident investigation, a little bit easier, because if you know that it happened, let's say at your HMI level, then that's where you can target the initial part of your investigation. Securing remote access. This is hugely important because while secure remote access may provide a convenience for us, it also provides probably one of the riskiest parts of potential attacks. Determine what systems absolutely require remote access. Poorly protecting this access presents a significant risk, and it has been used in an initial attack vector within several attacks. Remote access is very helpful in 24-hour operations, but it's also a liability. Maintaining and enforcing good password management and limiting access only to what is needed for each user can go a long way to reduce the effect of a compromise of a specific account. Other limitations that make it much harder for attackers would be restricting which ports, which are basically like the doors of a building for those who don't work in IT, reducing the ports that are accessible from a specific IP address. So if I'm accessing it from my home because I'm a supervisor, maybe I have more access than, say, a random attacker whose botnet just found that this listener is available for me to try and attack. Limiting access to specific source addresses. So the organization should know what my home IP address would be, where I'm going to be coming in from, and just limit access to this particular account from my IP address. So that if I try to access it from a hotel, I'm not able to do that. And then finally, reducing what can be done via this remote connection to the minimum necessary to perform the functions that you need. Now, I know that's not necessarily easy, because if you are a supervisor and you need to have a wide range of access, it may not necessarily be a plausible way for you to reduce that on that particular account. Incident response planning. Doug mentioned that we are now obligated to provide incident response plans. And so practicing how we would respond during an attack is one area where we can reduce surprises that we hadn't planned for. It also establishes key decision points and when to involve greater levels of leadership. If you need to make the decision to shut down one part of your operations, that's probably going to have an impact on your schedule, your treatment schedule. And again, I'm not a water expert here, but it probably would impact your schedule as far as how much you can deliver at a specific time. Several things that we can establish beforehand that will facilitate a much faster response. are writing the steps down that we need to perform in the event that we are attacked, determining who needs to be notified and at what point, and who needs to make critical decisions. And then finally, identifying the decision point for a full shutdown of the affected system. Once these steps are established, it's useful to exercise this plan periodically and make relevant adjustments to or as the environment changes. As we discover new vulnerabilities, as we did with Unitronics, we can see where we're affected, and we can patch those systems immediately. This methodology takes opportunities away from the botnets of the world and those that are specific attackers targeting very specific areas. I mentioned the attack surface. That's how we describe the areas where you might be vulnerable. How many assets do you have? How many of them are public facing? And then how many of them hold critical data or critical access to your operational systems? Effectiveness refers to your vulnerability management program's ability to reduce your risk. The less severe, it also helps to reduce the severity of a breach, and this effectiveness is measured by a predictable cadence, metrics that you collect to show your progress, and institutionalizing procedures that prevent a vulnerability backlog. We sometimes refer to that as tech debt. As you start ending up with systems that need to be patched, but you don't have time to patch them, and then that happens over here in this other segment, you're going to end up with so many vulnerabilities that are still open and need to be patched that you're not able to patch them all in a given time. So you don't want to end up in that situation. It's very hard to get beyond that. Prioritization, identifying critical assets, especially those that are public facing, and targeting those first for remediation can help make your program a lot more effective. And then finally, predictability, knowing when internal stakeholders know what to expect, buy-in is a lot easier because they know when their downtime is going to be, and you can schedule that at a time that is convenient. It's not to say that you won't have surprises here and there at different times, but it certainly makes vulnerability management much more effective and predictable. The vulnerability management cycle is typically described in 4 stages: discovering your assets and knowing what you have, grouping assets by type, prioritizing them based on their criticality to operations and other environmental considerations, and then finally remediating and mitigating vulnerabilities based on publicly available information about that specific vulnerability. It's also, I want to make a side note here, it's also very valuable to subscribe, if budget allows, to paid vulnerability intelligence services. What those can tell you beyond public reporting is at what stage of interest are those vulnerabilities on the dark web to, say for example, ransomware actors. These tend to go through a predictable stage of development where they first discuss a vulnerability and how useful it might be, to creating a proof of concept exploitation of this vulnerability, to finally incorporating that exploitation into their automated means. So knowing what stage it's in can give you a better idea of how much time you have to patch those critical systems. All right, I turn it back over to Doug for tabletop discussion.
Okay. And so from a vulnerability management perspective, just to go back one, I'm a proponent of you don't have to patch everything, specifically on the OT side, right? I mean, in an ideal world, we would patch and mitigate every vulnerability, but that's just not realistically possible for most of us. So the philosophy that I like is the now, never, next. Now, next, never. Things that I have to patch because of the vulnerability within my specific system immediately, right? You think of those are on the IT side. We do a lot of immediate patching or patch Tuesday work. We do not do that on the OT side generally. So, but there could be times when a vulnerability comes up that is in my particular architecture that I decide I need to patch this immediately. The next cycle is the next maintenance cycle, which may be 30 days away, 90 days away, whatever. Normally that is something that we would patch that we see has a vulnerability. There's a potential risk there, but it's not a real high risk, or I have other controls in place or other mitigations I can do until we get to that next cycle, next maintenance cycle. And then the never. So, I mean, that sounds counterintuitive to a lot of people, but there are some vulnerabilities out there that I'm never going to patch, right? Because in my architecture, there is no way for that to be discoverable or exploited. Now, you have to be really sure if you make that decision, because hackers get smarter every day. New vulnerabilities come up tomorrow that weren't there today that may expose that vulnerability. So you do have to consistently work at evaluating your environment and making sure that you're staying up to date with all of this. So the value of exercise. We do a lot of exercise. Did anybody go to Texas Water this year? Everybody watch Ops Challenge. Exercising things that are operational necessities for a plant, right? So for example, how do we go into confined space? How do we don SCBA to pull somebody out of that confined space so we don't wind up with multiple victims, et cetera? Same thing is very valuable within cybersecurity, right? So the cheapest way to get the bang for your buck is to do tabletop exercises. So when you look at this, you need to understand what are the kind of attacks that I'm most likely to face. Much of the same things that Lance talked about when we talk about incident response. Who's going to make those decisions? Do I have an incident response plan? How am I going to execute that? How am I going to communicate out to the public when I have to, if we need to issue a boil order or some other kind of statement to the public? And then, do we have cybersecurity insurance? How would that play? And what would we do there? Lance, did you have
Quick
something?
question for the audience. So true, false here. Who thinks cyber insurance will cover nation state attacks? I see one head nodding no. Maybe. So the truth is, some do, some don't. And this is why it's important to do a tabletop exercise, because you sometimes don't know those things until you get into the tabletop exercise and you reach that question. Because I can tell you, having from experience, lawyers don't think about that kind of stuff. They think about, okay, this is our policy. Yep, all the wording looks good. These are the changes we want to make, and then they send it off for approval by the CEO. So, yes, some cyber insurers will say that they're excluding nation-state attacks from coverage. Now, that's not the same as ransomware. They do, thankfully, differentiate between nation-state attacks and ransomware attacks. But if a nation-state attacks your facility and you have to shut down and experience a lot of financial loss, you may not get financial recovery from your insurer based on that. So definitely read through those cyber insurance policies, or at least point that out during your tabletop exercises so that your legal counsel can review that.
Thank you. So tabletop exercise is very similar to this. A bunch of people sitting around a table, right? And you're going to go through and you're going to exercise what your plan is. The benefits of this, it's very low cost, right? How much does it cost to sit 15 people around this table and walk through a cyber scenario? Very little. Now, the question is, who should participate? You want to make sure that you have your senior utility management on that participant list. Do not give your general manager a pass. Do not give your operations manager a pass. Do not give these folks a pass. Because when an actual event occurs and your general manager walks into the operations center for the first time, everybody's going to look to them for an answer, right? You don't want it to be a pickup game at that point where they have never been faced with this scenario, with making these specific decisions. You want them to have been through this process several times, albeit scenario and not a real world thing. So, but you don't want it to be a pickup game. So make sure your senior utility management is involved. Make sure your legal representation is involved. One that I left off this list that Lance brought out, a lot of times your cybersecurity insurance providers will participate in your exercises, right? And they will be able to give you the specifics of how their company will view those questions as you get to them, right? Obviously, you want your IT and your SCADA techs and your plant personnel involved, cybersecurity, and it's a great opportunity for people to learn as well, right? So anybody that you have, if you have a developing leaders program, if you have a supervisory training program, you want these people to get insight into this process and learn more about the organizational decision-making process that's going on. You want to bring them in for this.
Doug mentioned a really salient point here about cyber insurance participating in the tabletops. There's also sometimes a stipulation in cyber insurance that you must execute tabletop exercises regularly. So that it is always a great idea to loop them into potential tabletop exercises that you do, as well as they may have a preferred incident response retainer company that you use to augment your own internal teams. They may specify specific people that you have to go to for third-party incident response support. So definitely a great point to bring in cyber insurance.
Yeah, and that brings up another point that I should probably include in the slides. If you are using a third party to do your incident response, a lot of people are now using a third party to do incident response, specifically on the OT side, right? Because that's a very specialized thing with high risk and high consequence if you screw that up. So some people are using an incident response retainer. You need to get a little background on that company. Obviously, you'll vet if they're qualified, but what is their capacity? If they have five facilities in the DFW area that get hit, are they going to have the capacity to put boots on the ground and actually do anything to help me? Or are they going to go to the biggest facility that pays them the most money, and I'm going to be at the bottom of the list and they'll get to me next week? So make sure you look at that capacity of those people as well, because if there is a large-scale incident, a widespread incident, you're going to need to make sure that they can respond to meet your needs. Okay, so we kind of already talked about the benefits of tabletops. Some of the things that we see, I've done a number of these at a number of different organizations now. The first thing is people don't even realize you have a plan, right? If you haven't actually exercised it, if you haven't trained it, a lot of times the folks in the plant, like in IT, in cybersecurity, we know we have a plan, we know how it'll be executed. But when I go out at 8 p.m. on a Friday night and there's a junior operator at the plant, he doesn't know we have a plan. All he knows is if something goes really bad, I call my supervisor, right? So he doesn't know what their initial response actions need to be, et cetera. A lot of times we find out as we go through these exercises, management thinks we have a certain capability internal to our staff or on contract, but you'll find out when you walk through that and you ask your cybersecurity person or your IT person or whoever's responsible for your response, hey, what do we do in this case? And they'll say, well, I don't know. John was our guy for that, and he left for Brazos River Authority 2 months ago, right? He moved on. So now we're kind of just hanging out there. We don't have anybody to fill that hole, or we've never had anybody with that skill set. So we need to get somebody on retainer. So a lot of times by walking through these plans in your exercises, you'll find where those gaps and seams are. And then chain of command is always very important. Who's going to make those decisions? Because in lieu of a stated who is going to make those decisions, you're going to wind up with a bunch of senior leaders or a bunch of people that are going to have conflicting opinions on what should be done. And that's not the place in a real incident to work those kind of things out. Okay, so to conduct a tabletop exercise, number one, you're going to want to plan, right? determine what the scope is going to be. And for a tabletop or any exercise, it can be as large or as small as you want it to be. It can be very simple, whereas, and I'll show some examples of this later, or it can go through the entire process from when we might have gotten some notification from some intelligence agency or from some vendor to how we will conduct our after action report, right? My suggestion is start small, start with something that's more manageable, and then after you've done a couple of exercises, bring the entire team together and try to look at the entire life cycle from threat analysis and from threat indication and discovery all the way through that process until you've resolved the incident, made all your notifications, and you're sitting there having an after-action meeting at the end. Okay, so some examples, and I'm going to ask for audience participation here. Guidelines, don't fight the scenario. All scenarios are manufactured, right? So in developing a tabletop exercise, you're going to come up with injects that your plant personnel or your reasonable people will stand up and say, that could never happen here because. Okay, let's wave the magic wand for a second and say, it's going to happen because we want to exercise this capability. So tell me how you would respond to this, right? It's good to know that it can't happen and why, but at the same time, we want to be able to exercise that specific part of the plan. So don't fight the scenario. Make sure it's a safe space where everybody can speak up and have their opinions done. So it's a very simple scenario. And we used to, in the military, we would go around and we would drop inject cards on people whenever we did inspections. And I would walk over to Lance and I would give him a card as the inspector. And I would say, your computer screen says this, Lance, what do you do? So this is a ransomware case. It's really fun to go out at midnight and drop that on the operator on shift because that's generally the most junior operator that is at that facility, and see if they have an idea of what it is. And then use it as a teaching moment if they don't have it right. If they actually pull out a binder or a checklist and follow it, then you get an A+. But you would look at this. So you should have a response for ransomware. It's one of the most likely scenarios. All of your people should know what to do in the case of a ransomware message popping up. So another good one is, you get a call from a cybersecurity analyst who says, we have a known intruder on your network. What's the first thing you do? I need to remote into your computer and take control. Give me your password. Is it a social engineering attempt? You can go down that avenue, or you can just go down the avenue of, what would they do if an actual agency cybersecurity analyst called them and gave them that inject, right? How would they handle that? We have indications that somebody is changing settings on your control system. How do you handle that? I mean, that's kind of the Oldsmar scenario, right? People were changing it. What are you going to do? Very simple. Then you can go much more complicated. This is part of a more complicated scenario that you would build, where you would say, okay, you're getting an intelligence inject from the water ISAC. How are you going to deal with that? So then you're going to have to look at things like, does this apply to us? Do we have this equipment? Do we have this threat in our area? Is it similar to something that we have? Who would make the decisions on if we go to an increased security posture? Who makes the decision if I pull that connection from my business network to my industrial control systems network? What are all the different scenarios? Or are we going to say, this wouldn't even really apply. At this point, we're going to take no action, right? As you step through each one of these inject cards, the scenario will develop, and you're going to be looking for gaps and seams within the incident response plan there. And then finally, this is one of my favorites. How are your people in the field who are working on a leak, et cetera, going to react when a news reporter comes up and sticks a microphone in their face and asks, right? So, You know, I mean, everybody knows I'm not supposed to say anything to the media, but when the camera turns on and the microphone's there, everybody, a lot of people want their 30 seconds of fame. So it's interesting to do that kind of stuff. And then finally, you know, this is just another example of something, you know, that is a little bit further down in that scenario. And you guys can take a look at these. A lot of times, you know, this goes through the how you would communicate to the public. Would you issue a do not drink or boil order? Those kind of things as you go through. So bring together the whole team, from your public affairs people to your lawyers to your incident responders to your insurance people, as many people as you can get at that table to do that. And as a summary, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in 1 hour and 50 minutes, and I'm sorry we didn't give you a break. But we wanted to maintain the time for a few minutes of just like open discussion, question and answers. And we'd be happy to entertain any questions or commentary that you guys might have. Okay. Well, thank you. I really appreciate the time that you guys gave us and our opportunity to come out here. And, you know, sometimes I forget to do this, but thank you for what you guys do every day. I mean, meeting the public need, public health and safety is very important. The job you guys do is extremely difficult. I'm sorry cybersecurity is not making it any easier. It's just another risk that we have to deal with, but a very important subject. So hopefully we have been able to raise your awareness on the issues and how to potentially mitigate them. But if you have any questions or anything, don't hesitate to contact us. All of our information, I believe, yeah, my information is up here. Call me, email me, whatever you need. I'm happy to help out. And appreciate the time from you guys. Elston, did you want to
wrap up a few things?
Oh, okay.
Well, thank y'all for your attention today. I just want to make a few announcements before we wrap up. Please make sure that you are signed in, and with the operator number, make sure you do the evaluation before you leave. And just again, thank you for coming. Anything else to add? Anybody?
Just that we'll go ahead and send everyone who signed in and registered a copy of the updated presentation, so that way you have all of the information together.
All right. All right. Thank y'all.